thanks for engaging in those conversations. We'd like to hear, some of what you are working on. We'll go to our facilitators, get kind of the most important points that were made, and then we're going to open it up to everyone to talk about, some of the discussion we had from the panel, but also anything else that you learned in the breakout room. But how about Tuado? Would you like to go first, please?
Yeah, of course. So we were just talking about some of the barriers from early dissemination, and so kind of what results are worth disseminating, kind of knowing where to share. So what could you share? Issues with confidentiality and things like that, and also kind of knowing how to reach like a broader audience. So and actually connecting with like patients.
Great, thanks. Jody Ann?
Yeah, my breakout room shared a lot about their early experience in dissemination that didn't really go really well within the community, and especially caused a lot of mistrust, which also led to mistrust of pharmaceutical companies. So that didn't really make any of the issues better. So they really wanted to learn so that they can move forward within their career of how they can improve dissemination, as well as like learn from the larger group that we have today.
Great, thanks, Jody. Gabe, would you like to share?
Yeah, sure. So my group really talked about community engagement, how going from community engagement to it being community driven. I think Jen really touched on this and then opened my eyes to really including participants in the community in the and basically the, I want to say this correctly, basically in the team and building the project out, like having more stakehold in what goes on in the project and not just being used just for engagement or just to hear their voice, but to be part of the main cohort that's making some decisions in the project as well.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Courtney?
Sure. So my group talked about kind of processes and early engagement. And not only do we, need to know our audience, but we also need to integrate kind of the whole process in it. So we need to talk to the physicians enrolling the patients in the trials. We need to talk, to the caregivers of the families as well. And we need to really build that trust in the research process and communicate transparently about the whole steps. What does it mean to be a placebo-controlled trial? Those sorts of things.
Great. So I'd like to open up to the panel and to anyone else that would like to comment on some of these higher level themes or anything else that came out of the breakout room, something you'd like to share. When you raise your hand, we'll call on you. We're really looking at, talk about. Yeah, Janice?
Yes, I was in the group 4, and I really appreciated what everybody had to say, because I had not heard before today that, the early results might be, are a challenge, right? So I know PCORI is one of the earlier organizations, but I don't know that for sure, who is asking for it. And I hadn't really thought about it, because the project I was on, we did have successful early results, right? That we found the social workers could work at their licensure by offering this community resource specialist in the clinics. So I hadn't thought about the other side, where you're talking, I actually am on a project, though, a large RCT, where we don't have a lot of data. We don't actually have data yet, right? So if we gave out a mid-project results, then there really wouldn't be much. But somebody mentioned about confidentiality, and that can be very true too. It's something you have to think about. So thank you.
Great, Janice, thanks. Anyone else? Can anyone else speak to, we're talking about what are some instances where that early engagement was successful, maybe where there were barriers. Anyone else from the panel or from our participants, anything they'd like to share?
One of the things that I shared was that at the beginning of the PREPIT trial, they spent a lot of time bringing me up to an understanding of what they were talking about. As they were writing the protocol, I had the phone number for Sheila, and she just was bombarded with calls from me of, what does this mean? What does this mean? And she has children, so she was able to teach at a grade school level to bring me up to an effective understanding of what it was. So that process of sitting at the table, I never felt like I was at the little kids' table. I felt like I had a seat and they were welcoming me. And that was almost a combination of just the right person to answer my questions. So it was fortuitous, but it led to me being very engaged and very willing to be a part of it and to share what I've been given.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's it's the building of the two sides of the relationship, and Cynthia mentioned that. We'll go to Cynthia.
Jeff makes a hugely important point about the skills of people trying to do this communication work. And I think that often doesn't come up. It's like, here's your dissemination model, here's your steps, right? Implement it. But what Jeff's speaking to is that it takes really skilled people to understand how to do this communication work well in a way that meets a lot of different needs, right? So, that particular trial might have been, very, very technical, and there were a lot of, very, not just jargon, but complex steps and processes that had to be explained. In a different project, it might be a different set of challenges, right? I'm always very impressed, and I know that one of a colleague from EPA is joining us today. I'm always very impressed in the environmental health space, like how much work community groups have to do to learn the language and learn the processes and learn the forms and learn the regulations in order to even get to step one in engaging in conversations about this and understanding the information that comes out of the agency. So I think just really, keeping in mind the skills that are necessary for effective dissemination work is a really important point. So thank you, Jeff, for that, because that makes a big difference. If you don't have skilled communicators on the team, you can have the best model, the best intentions, the best materials, but it still probably won't work very well.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. David?
And just to add to what Jeff said, it's not just Jeff learning from Sheila and the Prep It team, but we learned a lot from Jeff in the early phases of this trial as well. If you look at some of the early iterations of our consent form, I think Jeff contributed a lot to the language in those, also to our consent approach with our deferred consent model and not speaking to the patients at a time where they have a severe fracture and going in for surgery where they're not going to absorb the information in the trial, but at an appropriate time afterwards where they can at least comprehend the information and know what they're actually consenting to, are all things that we took back from our patient advisors in the Prep It trial as well, just to name a couple things up front.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. Yeah, there's a good, like I said, it's a bi-directional. This is really important of the both sides are learning, have the willingness to learn. So yeah, when it comes to communication, has anyone else had an example where communication was really solid, really helped with bringing a project together?
This project is a perfect example of a positive opportunity, early engagement, being able to bring more people on. This, the show project. What comes to mind is unsuccessful products that were going out for dissemination in recruitment, where we provided a lot of input, but it was after it was basically done. We provided some before, but the product was done by a professional, video company or whatever, and it didn't really. There was a lot of issues in there that I didn't think were going to work well, right? But we couldn't do much unless it was remade after the fact.
Thanks, Janice. Yeah, it's hard to fix once you've already started the process and trying to pull it back.
Well, and I think too, often research teams are focused on budget. So you bring in a contractor and then you have to fix things after the fact, rather than having those voices at the table in the beginning, right? Like we often hear, right, that researchers don't want to spend the time and the money to build relationships, but we know that it's not just about being cost effective, but then you're actually creating a better product in a less amount of time than having to go back and fix something, right? Love this discussion. I also want to, encourage those, while the breakouts were really focused on the 10-step framework and early engagement, we were talking about principles and characteristics of effective dissemination or barriers. And that had to do, again, with, ethics, trust, collaborations, accessibility. So certainly, open to the group, if for a couple of minutes, if people had other reactions to the earlier discussion around ethics and empathy, and some of those other things. Yeah, Hala.
Yeah, thank you, Hillary. I appreciate the discussions today. Yeah, I was reflecting on some of the earlier discussions, and I certainly appreciate and agree with a lot of the statements made. I think there's a few things, though, I didn't hear yet, and I'm sure we will probably hear throughout the day as we move through. But I think there's also flexibility and nimbleness that's needed for this work. And so often, when research is being funded, there's very strict timeline. There's obviously, scope of work and deliverables that follow that timeline. And really, to do this work in partnership with community, that timeline needs to have that flexibility and nimbleness, or it is very hard to build those relationships of trust or to convey empathy. And so I think I'd like to raise that to the group as we talk about dissemination. And I think the other thing that is really required in this work for engagement, particularly of communities and feeling like that there's an equitable partnership, is power sharing. Because we still talk about, this research from the lens of the researcher, of the institution, of the system. We still aren't co-designing and co-creating with community and allowing community to lead what those research priorities should be. And so I think that's something to consider as we talk today around what does that power sharing look like when we really want to equitably partner with community, and how do we put in the structures to support that? And that takes a lot of time, that takes culture change, that takes funding, and that takes that flexibility and nimbleness. But certainly, I think in the work I've done as a patient family engagement consultant over the years, that power sharing has to be part of that discussion, and supporting that, nurturing that is really important.
I see lots of head nods and thumbs up. A few more people have started raising their hand. It's always the brave first participant. So thank you, Hala, for sharing. Gerard.
No, I want to thank Hala because I was, you said a lot. And that's really what I was alluding to, is that you really want to know. I was more curious about, in the breakout rooms, about the challenges, specifically about mistrust. I think a lot of what you just raised are those real barriers, those real concerns that specifically those within those communities are actually dealing with when this whole whenever there's some form of research that's being engaged. So I'd like to learn maybe from the group who actually had some big mistrust issues or big problems, like what were some of the barriers or some of the insights that you got from the mistrust that was captured.
I wanted to pose a question as I'm hearing these great remarks and reflecting on my own experience. I think that some of this work is really challenging to do on a project by project basis, right? And so if you think about a clinical trial that might last, 4 or 5 years, and within the constraints of budget, mounting a robust effort for engagement, which, people have said takes a long time, and continued relationships. I'm starting to think in my work that building advisory boards that can be, organization-wide or coalition-wide. For example, I work in bladder cancer, and there's a patient advisory network that's been created that, you know, they're building knowledge, trust, and collaboration, and then they work on multiple projects, right? So when the next thing comes up, there's already a board kind of ready to go. And I work with a network of community health centers that has a member advisory board. Similarly, you know, if you want to work with them, you can engage with this existing group who have become pretty expert at doing the work. So, you know, I'm starting to think that these relationships can be more enduring, productive, if they transcend projects, right?
Brian Gutierrez, you want to chime
Yeah,
in?
thanks, Joe. Sorry, I just got here, but I just want to touch on some things that Hala did mention, especially on accessibility. I'm a patient with a disability, so I participated in a couple of clinical trials before, and my experiences was very not very positive, and there were issues where I encountered some issues with accessibility, and getting those research findings be disseminated to our community. It really takes a lot of collaborative effort really to have those findings being disseminated, and also to have flexibility, like many people have just touched on today. It really takes a lot of empathy, but also a lot of open-mindedness, because at the end of the day, it's really about collaborating with the needs of the community, right? Patients as well, that really don't have the luxury to really have access to those findings. And it's very important to have an open-minded approach to really create a more accessible environment, especially if you want to convey a positive message, or even sharing information, right, or results of a research project that would be beneficial to the community or even patients like myself. So it's very, really important that accessibility and also flexibility, comes into play here. And also mistrust, like George just said, because I have issues with mistrust, and especially with research groups in the past. So it's really, really important to build trust, with the community and also patients as well, especially those with people of color. That plays into mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Jen?
Thanks. I just wanted to co-sign what Hala was saying, really appreciated that, and also what Carmi was saying. And I think both of this really gets to the need for more structural change within the research enterprise, because so much of it is still, like when we talk about impact, so much of it is still academically led, or academic outcomes, like, getting more research grants or having academic publications. And so that drives so much of it. And I really think there are roles that funders and publishers and research institutions can take to leverage their own power and privilege that they have to further operationalize our ability to have the more of the community-driven, community-led work that Hala and Carmi was bringing up. And I totally agree about these, doing things beyond the project level, because that's way too much of a burden and doesn't work to do that at the project level, versus, some of these capacity issues, funding issues, in community leadership or collaboration structures. And that also, again, the way that we define impact doesn't incentivize researchers to be able to invest in the way that they need to for these kinds of shifts. So like if you have a researcher that's, thinking like, am I going to pour in the effort that it takes to do the kind of dissemination that we're talking about, or am I going to put that into this revision of a manuscript that I'm going to have, which counts in my promotion and tenure process, which again is should not be valued in the same way that impact on health and equity is valued. And yet that's so much of what the research enterprise works under. So how do we, shift that, not at an individual level, but the systemic level? Thank you.
Very well said. Yeah, the real consideration in academic institutions of what is valued. Brian?
Thanks. So I wanted to follow up on, Jen, what you just said, and then on some comments following up on what Carmit said previously. So, I'm engaged in a set of debates with a set of research colleagues in practice and policy leaders, where we're actually confronting the point that you raised explicitly, and that is, do we design and carry out a project with the interests and needs of the research team, first and foremost, or the policy practice community and patients and so on. And the specific focus is maternal health and maternal health equity. And we know that as researchers, we like to deploy an intervention with 1 or 2 or 3 elements that is very clean, easy to study, where we can conduct an elegant, rigorous clinical trial, and the biostatisticians love us. The policy practice leaders, of course, want to throw everything at it but the kitchen sink, because their goal is to achieve impact. So, I've started to think through the trade-offs between starting small and working up versus going big and taking in all of the above. For us as researchers, our obligation is to develop methods to allow us to learn what we need to and have some rigor and internal validity and all those other buzzwords, with a primary focus on the policy practice needs and improvement. In terms of Carmit, your comments on different structures and mechanisms for engagement, ultimately, of course, we would like to have everybody involved in everything, which can't happen. So thinking about a layered approach, where we, for example, have some existing patient advisory councils that provide some high-level, periodic oversight and input to a project. We're now talking about a supplementary patient panel that includes perhaps a subset of the existing standing patient advisory council members and some others that we recruit who are available for a more intensive level of engagement, and they would be compensated. And we're also talking about another level of engagement, which is beyond the 15-person national advisory board that we typically convene for these projects, that allows us to have not just one representative from a payer or from another health system, but instead dozens. And obviously, we can't have an advisory meeting with 250 individuals, but there are methods that we can use to engage them through periodic webinars, through periodic online requests for input and feedback, and to gain that buy-in, to gain their input and their advice along the way, in a way that, again, allows us to have a much richer form of engagement in a manner that's feasible. So again, for the research teams, funders, and others to think through the kinds of methods and approaches that can be used to try to balance these competing needs, I think will help us all to do better and to have some feasible ways for doing better in our engagement.
I work in EPA's Office of Research and Development, which is our research arm of the agency. And when you talk about barriers, I think some of the most difficult barriers are that we are a regulatory agency, and that regulatory and the legal framework and what we can say and what we don't say is a barrier for communicators like me who are trying to get information out there. And the one example I'll give, which kind of touches on what Helen and Gerard have talked about, I just did a project in East Orange, New Jersey, on lead in drinking water, and we sampled the water of several people's homes. So we had to engage the community to be able to get in their homes, for one. But the action level for lead is 15 parts per billion. So once you get past for even explaining what 15 parts per billion means, if the researchers didn't find lead at that level, they were like, we don't have to report anything. But there's no safe level of lead. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that we had health messages. So even if we found it at 6 parts per billion or 1 part per billion, there's still no safe level of lead. So what can these people in their homes do to protect their families, their children, whatever? And so I made sure that that language was included. But I agree that how we disseminate information and everything that we work on, we really just need to think about the people and co-creation. Like, that's where I want to get to on all of our research. I'm working on a project in Toledo, Ohio right now on lead and water filter education, and how do we help people learn how to use water filters appropriately? Because that was a problem that we saw in Benton Harbor, Michigan, when we sampled the water there. The water filters worked, but only when they're used appropriately. And so just handing somebody directions isn't the way to go. And in Toledo, what we're doing is working with kids so they can go home and be able to help their families install and watch the water filters. So middle school teenagers, and getting their involvement and why this is important. So working with the community is really important. Thank you.
Lonnie, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, everyone. This is, again, I always appreciate those who are willing to go first and drive this discussion. Again, Hala, thank you for kicking us off so we really could get all of these perspectives on the table. Lots to think about. What I would like to do is start by talking about a few of the tools that we have sent to you in advance of today's meeting. And the first one, and I will drop it in the chat in case people didn't get it, but it's the Clear Communication Index. And the Clear Communication Index from the CDC, again, has some really interesting prompts that are important when we think about dissemination tools, but also, Cynthia Bauer, who was on the CDC and helped develop it, had some great rubrics, if you will, or there's a scoring sheet, a scorecard that is part of the Clear Communication Index. I'm actually going to share my screen too. Hi, Cynthia, welcome back. And I wanted to take some time first before we talk about sort of PCORI's engagement rubric and a couple of other tools that we've used here at the Patients Program. But I was hoping, Cynthia, you could give sort of an overview of the Clear Communication Index and some of your sort of thoughts in terms of the development of it, the scorecard, and how that tool can really be used no matter what framework someone might be using for continuous dissemination and engagement efforts in research.
Sure. So the index grew really out of a CDC colleague and my kind of wondering about how the agency had done on the 2009 H1N1 response, and saying, even if you're an organization that's committed to all the things that we've been talking about, what actually happens, right, when you have to put out information, especially in an emergency situation. So that's what really kicked us off on a multi-year process that resulted in the index. And it was designed to do a couple of things. It was, first of all, intended to kind of standardize practices. And I think that's one thing that's kind of been a sub-theme of what we've been talking about, is that you can have one research team that's very aware of these issues and doing a great job, and then you can have another one that has no awareness and is not doing any of these things. And that's, often how it happens in big organizations. And so we were trying to standardize practices. We were trying to distill science into best practices, that could be used by communicators working under a variety of conditions and topics. So it's not topic specific. It's, a set of principles that have been derived from the literature and then tested with experts, with materials, with real world situations over time. And, I would say that one of the most interesting things, because we had an expert advisory panel, was they said what I said to you at the very beginning, is they said, if you're thinking about trying to get information to people, you always have to start with the who, right? With this audience question. And that's a very hard thing to put a numerical value on, like, how do you do that? And so that's why when you look at the score sheet, there's 4 open-ended questions that you have to answer first. And we find that even if you do nothing else with the score sheet, answering those 4 questions is often extremely valuable. And then if you want to, of course, move on to the scoring, because the scoring can get you, even further into what you're trying to do. But those 4 open-ended questions really make a difference in terms of getting focused on a communication task. So I don't know, Hillary, is that enough of an overview?
So I'm pulling up some of the things in the index, and similar to what you just said is, I know a couple of people were like, well, wait a minute, why aren't we using the scorecard for the toolkits? But we recognized that those questions were really what we wanted our participants today to use as we looked at the different toolkits that will be part of a session later this afternoon. But I did want to hear from, again, the other members of the panel about the Clear Communication toolkit. And so let me share my screen once again. And I want to talk specifically about developing effective communication products. And so hopefully everyone can see this. Did you identify your intended audiences? Did you conduct audience research? Did you identify your behavioral objectives and key message? Determine how your material will be formatted and distributed? And hear from first, David, and then the rest of the group of, when you were thinking about developing your effective communication products and you thought about audience, right? In our first session today, and we've talked about, developing the audience for what you want to communicate, did you answer these questions in the beginning, or how might someone go about, say, conducting audience research in their project? Thoughts from the panel. David?
Yeah, so I was brought on to the Prep-It trials when a little bit after, like not right at the very beginning, but pretty close to the beginning. So we had a lot of these things already established when I joined, but we certainly gave a lot of consideration to the audience. So we obviously brought on our patient advisors for this, but when you think about the end use of this product, right? And our study was comparing iodine and chlorhexidine for the use of preventing infections in participants. Who are the targeted end users of this, right? Participants tend to benefit from the product, but who's administering the product? Nurses in the operating room, surgeons in the operating room, fellows and trainees in the operating room. So we established committees with these individuals involved so that they can share their experience with our interventions. We also thought about other committees outside of just the operating room to integrate into our project. So one of the Prep-It trials is funded by PCORI, but another one's funded by the Department of Defense, which required establishment of a military advisory group. And if you think about the applications of our military personnel that go abroad, they have real, they're also a group that stands to benefit from potentially reduced infections from broken limbs abroad. We brought on a methodology panel as well to help guide us through the intricacies of our design, because we used a novel design in the trial. It was a randomized crossover trial, and that was new to us, and we didn't have the expertise in that particular domain. So we identified individuals that do and brought them to coach us along throughout the project to make sure that we're not making any major mistakes that's going to jeopardize our final outcome. We brought on, again, like I said, an OR core. We brought on an infectious disease core as well, because although the orthopedic community is involved in this trial, right, because they're the ones that fix the limbs and are applying the iodine and chlorhexidine interventions, the outcome is relevant to the infectious disease community, because they're going to be a lot of the stewards and the experts that are going to be utilizing the results as well. And if it shows an impact in orthopedic patients, it's likely that impact can be translated into other disease disciplines as well. So we did give a lot of thought to developing a very comprehensive team. We thought about a lot of these questions during the early stages of our trial, for sure.
Thanks, David. Cynthia, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on that because I think David's example is perfect for showing the multiplicity of audiences. And what I find, and he used the term end user, and we use that term sometimes too, but a lot of groups that I work with find that jargon. And so I use it, but I often have to explain who an end user is, right? Because that comes from human-centered design and usability testing that, they tend to talk about end users. But there's an example that I often use is that just to kind of show that sometimes it's not always obvious who your audience or end user is. I was doing an exercise with a occupational safety and health team, and they were focused on equipment for woodland firefighters. And they wanted to redevelop this informational material. And so we started working on it, and they were sure that it was the firefighters themselves who were going to be the end users of this information. And as we went through it, it was really about selecting the equipment that firefighters wear. And my question to them was, do firefighters get to select their own equipment? And the answer was no. And I said, well, who selects the equipment? And they said, it's the fire chiefs. And I said, well, then actually what we're doing is we've got two audiences here, because we've got the fire chiefs who are the equipment selectors, and they need a certain set of information. And then the firefighters need to know how to put the selected equipment on properly so they're safe while they're fighting the fires. But that did not become obvious until we'd spent more than an hour talking that through, because they were sure that they knew that it was the firefighters who were the audience at the beginning. And so I think asking, who will ultimately use that, that's a really, helpful question. But just be aware that if you start talking to other people about end users, they might find that a little bit puzzling or jargony. But David's absolutely right that there's a multiplicity of audiences all the time. And the real trick is figuring out which information is most useful to that group. And it can come out in a very wide array of formats and products.
Thanks, Cynthia. Gerard, I want to hear your thoughts, and also to this comment from Hala in the chat, which is, what if the first question in the index was reframed? Did you partner with your intended audience or community? So thoughts on both the index and Hala's prompt.
Well, that's what we do. That's what we do first, is we partner with the community in development of our product. And part of our product is we just took a scientific, or if you call it from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's called get out the building. It means get out and talk to people. Biggest part of our product that we developed was speaking to everyone. And because what happens when you go through this process is that you realize what your intent is may not be necessarily what your audience is receptive to. And being able to learn from their perspectives of whatever product that you're putting out there is going to be more important. It's going to be more important in the long run if you execute in that fashion. So even being part of the Patients Professors Academy, you know what I mean? We learned that we learned in that process that, hey, from the researcher's perspective, from industry perspective, what is really the pain? What are really some of the components of research that affects not only the communities, but essentially the patients? So it's things, I think that the key theme that I think that what everyone was saying is that you have to go out and actually you have to actually go out and actually go listen and go actually, instead of doing the technological research or the intellectual and academic research, actually going out there within those communities, which means what, like Hala said, go out and partner with those communities to actually get the information that you need to actually provide a product that's not only relevant, but also respectful of those communities that you're eventually going to be working with.
Thanks, Gerard. Sneha, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And Hala, I see your hand is up and I will call on you momentarily. Sneha.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Hala said. And I also think that what Hala said about, integrating patients as like co-PIs is really, really important, because I think a lot of times, there are roles for advisory councils and advisory groups, but I also think more than that, a lot of patients, and I don't want to speak for everyone, are frustrated that, that's the only sort of thing that we're asked for. It's like nothing beyond actually just our perspectives. And so I think the action component is really important. And I think for myself, at least, I was so frustrated that all I would be asked for was advice and I would never actually get to do anything. And that's why Generation Patient was created, was because, we have the power and the tools and the resources and the experience to actually, act upon a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. But so I just really wanted to echo that, was like beyond just advisory. I think there's a huge, huge role to integrate patients within the research project as well. So.
Gerard, if you want, Colin, go ahead.
Real quick. But yes, we have the resources, but does the community have those resources? Or do we have a way of actually providing them with the medium to actually be involved in that shared decision making, because that's really what we're talking about here at the end of the day is, yes, we want to disseminate, yes, we have our intent, but does that intent match ethically and empathetically to those communities that we're dealing with? So unless we provide them with the actual resources to actually do it for themselves, so to speak, you know what I mean, and understand what we're providing for themselves, then we're going to continuously find not only these barriers, but create more gaps in the delivery of the healthcare that we're trying to provide them.
Thanks, Gerard. Hala.
Thanks, Gerard. I agree with your comments, and thank you, Sneha, for also lifting up kind of the power structures. Yeah, when I looked at this communication index, I thought about how this may have been rolled out, particularly with the COVID strategy. And I think part of this work is looking at the scripts and the prompts that big agencies put out. For example, you know, if we want to hardwire engagement, we have to change the questions. Those questions were not co-designed and co-created with community. And so to really integrate community, we have to prompt these types of indexes to encourage that engagement with community. I don't think it's enough to say, did you, you know, what's the intended audience? Did you have any research from that audience? It's prompting them to say, did you partner? Did you go out into the community? Did you have those conversations? And so I think about public health agencies, researchers, and other institutions during the pandemic who've used these tools such as the index, but it doesn't prompt anyone to say, let's partner. Beyond looking at any data or evidence base that's already perhaps been created, but looking at true partnership. And so I think we need to challenge ourselves with some of these tools. And I know part of today's exercise is to look at the dissemination tools, but I think for this index, flipping the script, it has to be part of the work.
Thanks so much, Hala. And absolutely, that also dovetails very nicely into one of the other sort of models that we've looked at and was part of our Patients Professors Academy as the trust trifecta from the Center for Implementation. And I don't know, Brian, if you have some comments about this specific framework, but you know, to what we've been talking about both in dissemination, what Hala just mentioned in terms of flipping the script about competence, authenticity, and connection. But you know, Brian, just some of your reactions about the trust trifecta and how that can be used, you know, as a tool to overcome some of these barriers that are being discussed today.
Yeah, I think this is very helpful. You know, the issue that I have with a lot of frameworks and you know, relatively straightforward, you know, forms of guidance like this is that, you know, often it's not complete. So, you know, we have the balance between, you know, trying to put something forward that's relatively simple and understandable versus, you know, the very long and complicated checklist of items that we need to attend to. That is not quite as easy to handle. So, you know, this is certainly important and useful, but we need to recognize that this is only one of the many requirements and considerations we need to attend to achieve full engagement, full trust, and ultimately to success in, you know, dissemination, implementation, and, you know, fulfilling our societal obligations.
Right. And so many of the threads from this morning's session, and then looking, you know, at things like empathy, shared values, confidentiality, integrity, accountability, all important terms that we've used, but we also need to figure out like, okay, but how do we build those things, right? And putting the time, the resources, and the effort into the trust trifecta in order to achieve, right, the best communications materials that we can. But other thoughts from the panel about, you know, this specific infographic and how this model might be useful, or, you know, what are the first steps to start in this, you know, Venn diagram, if you will, to get to that center bit of how do you build competence, authenticity, and connection across, you know, maybe a project, or as mentioned from some of our participants, you know, that go beyond a single project. David, love to hear your thoughts.
I'm really glad we're talking about trust because early on, about 15 years ago, when I was just getting into this field, that was actually one of my big failures early on, and it had a bit of a ripple effect with the success of the project. And it really forced me to think about these three elements, maybe not in the same structure that we're doing now, and look at how I can establish more trust and use that to leverage the success of the trial. If you don't mind me going into an example from a little while ago, one of my first exposures to research was in a neonatal intensive care unit. So we were doing research on premature infants. A lot of these infants were, just a couple pounds, and we're in the NICU for weeks, months, sometimes half a year before they're discharged. And we decided to bring out a study that required blood draws from these premature infants. And I was given the task of operationalizing this trial and making sure it's success. So I first started off, we got approval to do it. And then I would approach the parents of the newborn infants and ask them for a blood draw. Then I would go back the next day, I'll let them think about it for a little while. And I would realize that, a lot of my responses were, we thought about your trial, but we've decided not to participate in it. And after that's happened a few times, I started to reflect on, why is this actually happening? What's the root cause as to why there doesn't seem to be any trust in participating in this trial? And then I realized, well, okay, the participants or the parents of the participants are one element of trust, but we're in a neonatal intensive care unit. There's nurses there, respiratory therapists, doctors there too. And I realized that after I performed my consent, or I discussed the trial with the participants, they would speak to the nurses and to the doctors and ask for their opinion on the trials. But my dissemination to the nurses was relatively limited, right? We had a poster up in the NICU describing the trial, and they knew that blood was drawn, and they would just say to the participants or to the parents of the participants, okay, it's an interesting trial, but there's blood work involved with it. And that was the root cause of why this trial wasn't very successful early on when I was trying to enroll them. So I realized this. And after I realized this, I had to build trust not only with the participant, but with the NICU. And how do I go about doing that? Well, I started off by going to my supervisor and asking, can I get get a little bit of money so I can do some workshops in the evenings to build some trust with the nurses that this is a safe trial. I bought some pizza, or my supervisor provided some cost for some pizza, some donuts, some coffee, so they could come during their break. And for about 10 to 15 minutes, I would go over the details of the trial and explain that, okay, yes, there might be a little bit of extra blood that's drawn, but it's well below any established threshold. We're not doing it by creating additional pokes to inconvenience your newborn, but we're doing it when there's already scheduled blood draw, so the disturbance to them is relatively minimal. We express to them the potential benefits from this trial and the outcomes long term. And after I had these discussions with the nurses over the courses of a couple of weeks, and they got to know who I was as well, I noticed that the perceptions of the parents who I consented for this trial started to change, and enrollment improved, and this trial actually got underway despite some initial delays that we had. But it all boiled down to establishing trust. And I had to not just get trust from the participants, but from the team in the NICU, the whole team in the NICU, in order to make this a successful endeavor. And I think that relates to this trust trifecta here in multiple ways. It hits on the connection, point very, very well, that it had to establish a connection with the participants in order to make this a success.
Thanks so much, David. Sneha, thoughts on trust?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned early on, and I think part of it is because someone was really good at this in particular, was communication and meeting people where they are in terms of how they best communicate and what platforms work best for them. So I remember one of our program officers for a foundation would just text me some things. And I think that opened up a lot of trust in terms of me feeling like there was less of a power dynamic rather than just having to go through email for everything. And so I think that has helped with a lot of trust in our community too. I think for some of us, like our community members will contact us in every single way, whether that's through social media, email, etc. And I think that's just a huge part is like the method of communication too. I think that enables a lot more openness and also, I guess, just less formality for some people too. So
that's something that we've certainly learned in our projects is that not every patient advisor that we bring on communicates or likes to communicate in the same way. So, asking at the beginning, how do you want to connect with us? Is text message better? It's email? Is a monthly phone call? And setting those expectations in advance, right? You're creating transparency and authenticity in the connection that you want to build with the individual, not just assuming that because I'm, in front of my computer 5 days a week from 9 to 5, that's the most effective communication tool is using email. Some really great conversation that's happening in the chat. I just wanted to call out, Brian mentioned that language has to be accessible in order for building trust, cultural competence, and empathy. Carmeet said that it's important to consider competence and authenticity and connection look very different depending on who the audience is. And really hoping that we can dive into some of these comments in the breakout momentarily. On one hand, we're a few minutes behind, but we built in time because we knew that this discussion would go a little long. And before we go into our small group session, I do want to bring up PCORI's engagement rubric. Now, the engagement rubric, for those of you who are working with PCORI, might know that this is going to get revised in the next 6 months or so. And that's because PCORI's framework for engagement in research, which came out, I think, originally in 2011, a lot has changed in how we've engaged and with various populations over the past decade in patient-centered outcomes research. But, similar to the 10-step framework, they want to provide opportunities for, how do you plan the study? How do you conduct the study? And how do you disseminate results effectively? And again, thinking about sort of the 4 main components of the P Core principles. So things that our participants have mentioned about reciprocal relationships. Hala mentioned that in terms of many of these toolkits are systems focused and not about developing relationships. Talking about co-learning, how to talk about partnerships, transparency, honesty, and trust. And while I've always appreciated that PCORI's framework includes what potential activities can look like, sometimes, you hear, okay, I'm supposed to engage potential advisors in how to conduct the study, but do they know how to do focus groups and interviews? How do I engage them in a meaningful way that drives the work, again, whether it's about conducting the study or, as we're talking about today, disseminating study results. And so certainly this is something that has driven a lot of the work that, our team has done in the patient-centered outcomes research space. But I think, again, we really want to look at how all of these tools can help make research, again, more reciprocal, that we can learn. Many of you have mentioned that the researchers learning as much from the advisors as the advisors are learning from the researchers, developing the long-term sustainable partnerships beyond a project, and then transparency, honesty, and trust, where how do we expect people to want to partner with the research enterprise or the pharmaceutical enterprise if there's mistrust inherently from either the historical relationships that we have. So, briefly, I don't know if any of our panelists have comments on the engagement rubric before we go into our breakouts about the All of Us program. David.
Just further to your point about, establishing trust in the pharmaceutical community, one of the things that I'm still always baffled with when I look at some of the pharmaceutical initiatives going on is the use of the language that's still being used. Like, for example, it's still relatively common for me to come across the term subject instead of participant, or we're going to follow you instead of, we're going to check in with you throughout the duration of the trial. and just the medical jargon that's still present. I think it's getting better. Another point too is we're going to collect data instead of collect some information from you. Just these little small changes can really make a big impact in establishing more trust with some of these institutions that may have historically, like you said, Hillary, not have had a track record of success with this.
Janice and then Sneha.
Yeah, I served on that with Hillary and others, the updating of the rubric. I believe it was in 2015, but they had the framework before, but it was created in with the patient engagement advisory panel. So they felt it was time for an update, and they spent a couple of years in multiple focus groups and key informants, as well as a gathering of, I don't know, maybe 50 of us to talk about it. And what really came out of this was there was a lot of wordsmithing, perhaps they, might have been calling it that, but equity wasn't really front and center in the rubric. So in the next, rendition, whatever you will, see this as well as more community, insights from community and sustainability. You'll see some words that are missing in this. And I really appreciate that this was not a one and done, because they recognize that as time goes on, that things, change, right? Or society changes. So thank you. And also it was recommended, and David mentioned it, I had never thought of it because I'd never been in a project that did this, but to have the rubric discussed one of your very first meetings. And so I thought that was a great idea, and it's important. Then it can help to ground the project going forward.
Thanks, Janice. Sneha?
Yeah, just one quick comment too. I think one thing that I still really struggle with when we're trying to think about trust with industry especially is that a lot of it is not just historical, a lot of it is current too. And so, this is like a very realistic thing. And I think in a lot of ways it's, up to industry. It's nothing that can happen sort of in between. Because I mean, if patients are seeing $1,000 per month being like given toward their prescription medication, it's hard to have that trust that, these companies have our best interests in mind. So I just think that that's a really, really important thing that, industry has to be sort of willing and open, and also just more accountable to the fact that, there's not just historical mistrust, but current mistrust as well.
Thanks, Sneha. Perfect opportunity for us to then take what sort of these frameworks and your personal experiences into our case study session. Just an update on timing. So we're going to do a small group session for 15 minutes and go into the case study for all of us. I think some of you have had experience either participating in the All of Us program or advising. So really looking forward to hearing your personal experiences, both in terms of strengths and challenges.